for YouTube, like
Yeah.
cracking jokes. Well, welcome folks to our Room Acoustics event. Want to thank everyone for joining us here in person and virtually, and for Ben and Joe and David putting this together. It's kind of cool. It's the first time we've done like a in-person / streaming event, and it looks like it's going well. We've got a bunch of folks on the call. I'm glad you could make it. And I'm going to turn this over to Ben now, and he's going to kind of jump on and talk to us about room acoustics with David. And I don't know, Joe's going to chime in or not or anything.
Only when he tells me to.
All right. Well, then we'll let
he's a kind of constant chime.
we'll let the experts take over. Enjoy.
Yeah. He's always making noise someplace. Okay, guys. I know when this got started, we were calling it some kind of a digital room equalization or digital room. But what I thought was, and David and I talked about this at length, is that we all don't have access to a dedicated room, one that we can do anything we want to, or do we have access to digital equipment to kind of do the kind of adjustments that we might do. Plus, I personally don't like digital stuff, but I don't, a room, because that's kind of, you're forcing an issue, because that's what I look like to me. That's what it looks like to me. So what I'm saying is most of us have rooms that are average living rooms or a dedicated bedroom or a family room, which looks very much like this room, at least in dimensions. This is 20 feet by 15 feet by 8 feet tall. We have rooms in our homes just like this kind of thing. So I felt, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a situation where we don't always have access to fancy adjustments, but we can do things using what we've got in the room. I know when people ask me about, well, what do you think? You think I need a new amplifier, a new preamp, a new length of cable or something like that? And I go, no, the first thing you need to do is make your system work. And it will work. Most amplifiers and preamps and whatever you got there will do better than you think it will do if you spend the time to set things up in the room to cancel out some of the things that are objectionable to listening. And that has to do with the type of speakers you're using, the kind of pattern of spread pattern that they have, the dimensions of the room. There's a whole bunch of things like that come into play. So the first thing I do is I said, what's in your room? What do you got in there? Tell me about the couches. Tell me about the bookcases. Tell me about, window treatments. Tell me about all kinds of things that you have in the room that you prefer to be in to listen to. And I go, well, I don't know. Does that make a difference? I said, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. And I have a mess of a room at home, of several rooms, and I've got systems set up in every room, and all of them work because I just made a few minor adjustments here and there. And plus, there's enough junk in there to diffuse things, so we don't have a lot of problems with series reflections and things like that. So I lucked out in a couple of ways. My bedroom was a whole different story because it was nothing but pretty much bare walls with a few things in the room. And I then took advantage of placing the speakers in the corner to take advantage of a boost in the bass that we can get by using the corner as a surface. So first, we're going to start out with like in a living room. If you have a couch, or even if you have a dedicated chair to sit in. I know some of us have that, a dedicated chair that you found to be the center part of your room. But if other people are in the room and they want to hear some kind of a soundstage, that one chair is not going to be everybody's place to be unless they're sitting on top of each other. Right? So that's not going to happen. So we look at things that will help break up the sound so that it doesn't destroy what you're hearing from the speakers. Now, David and Joe are helping me out today, and David has a lot of experience in measuring rooms. He's got a lot of numbers in his head and a lot of numbers. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about how you would go about doing a digital adjustment to a room. David?
Yeah, sure. So, you make I want to kind of dovetail onto what you were talking about. So, and that is getting the speakers in the room to play together nicely first. What we end up when we're equalizing a room or we're applying digital corrections to a room, what we're trying to do is get the overall tonal balance that reaches our listening position to be pleasing. Very often, modern loudspeakers have very good frequency response on axis. Off axis, they can vary a bit. The response can be, some are well behaved and some are not. The problem is that when the sound that's going directly to our ears has one kind of tonality, and then all the reflections that happen throughout the room have a different kind of tonality. So the reflections off of your sidewalls or your ceiling, your room itself has a frequency response. Like your wall, when the sound bounces off, some of the energy is going to be reflected, and it'll be scattered in a little bit of a way, but it won't be scattered evenly with respect to frequency response. And the same thing goes for ceiling and floor. And if you have a bookcase, your bookcase has a frequency response, if you will. If the time of the reflection is very closely correlated to the time of arrival from the speakers, we say under 20 milliseconds, your brain is not able to kind of separate those two events very well. And so you end up with your brain just kind of merging those two signals together. And if they are incongruent, then you end up with both timing and also amplitude kind of problems in what you hear, like the tonality just isn't correct. So but even in a larger room, maybe you've got the speakers that are good 10 feet from the wall, say, for example. In this case, the timing issue is not a concern. The reflections off of the sidewalls are going to hit your ears late enough that your brain will be able to, or should be able to, separate those two events. We're still, though, concerned about how much reflected energy is in the room, how much energy the room stores, because that will smear some of the details in the music. It will obscure, not smear. It'll obscure some of the details in the music, right? So we don't want the room to be too reverberant, even if the room's large enough that our brain can separate the direct sound from the reflected sound. So treatment is still called for in larger rooms. It's just the approach is a bit different. I guess what I'm saying is, if we want to get the room so that it sounds correct first, if we try to apply digital room correction without getting the room correct first, as close as we can anyway, what the digital correction will do is there's a microphone involved, right? As you know, and the microphone is going to record the response of the system, and that microphone is going to pick up not just the direct sound from the speakers, but also the reflected sound throughout the room, and it's going to try to correct for that. So maybe there's a 15 dB hump at 80 hertz, for example, and maybe there are other frequency aberrations at other parts of the spectrum. Maybe the mids are too hot, so maybe there's 800 kilohertz. There's another peak or whatever. So we're going to pull those peaks down to try to address some of the issues and make the response even. But the problem with that is that we destroy the response of the direct sound from the speaker. We've compromised the direct sound in order to get an overall sound tonality that's balanced. And our brains, unlike the microphone, our brains do a better job of separating that direct sound from the reflected sound. And so we've created an even greater incongruity than what we had to start with. So it goes back to really kind of making sure that the response of the room is even as possible before we get into that. And tools that that we can use to kind of figure that stuff out include a traditional spectrum analyzer or Room EQ Wizard and a calibrated microphone. Those are inexpensive tools that are accessible to everybody. The software is free, at least for 2-channel use, and the microphones run around $100 for something that's calibrated and works pretty well, so that you can get kind of a sense of how reflective your room is. There's these notions of this RT30 and RT60 times that will give you a measure of the reflectivity of your room. And an RT60 is, if you clap your hands, that creates an impulse in sound. We're measuring how long it takes for that amplitude of that impulse to drop by 60 dB. In a small room, that's kind of a long time, but an RT30 might make more sense. But we want to understand how long it takes for energy to dissipate in a room. The reflections will just bounce all over the place, and eventually, with each bounce, there's attenuation in the signal, and eventually those bounces fall below the noise floor. So the question is, how long does that take? If you're in a small room, it can take over a second for those bounces to settle, and each reflection has a change in tonality that's going to kind of mess up what you're hearing in the diffuse field. So adding room treatments, or in some ways, like Ben was saying, making simple adjustments to the way that you have furniture set in the room can serve to attenuate those. The trouble with furniture is that it doesn't attenuate them in necessarily a very controlled way, but some is better than none, right? If you've ever had floor to ceiling windows that had no curtains in front of them, and then you added the curtains, you'll notice just by the sound of your voice a really dramatic change in the way that the room sounds and the comfort of the room. Same thing for an area rug put onto like a marble floor or a hardwood floor. Same kind of effect. So practically speaking, we can't all just be in a room like I have behind me where every wall is covered by some kind of room treatment. Sometimes there'll be cases where it'll have a mix of those things. The nice thing about the commercial products like I have behind me is that they have predictable behavior. So if you measure a room and the RT60 is 750 milliseconds and you want to get to 300, you can calculate how much of this material you need to add and where you need to put it, and you'll get predictable results. With the bookcase, like, you just have to try it and see, right?
Yeah, certainly.
All right, Ben. So that's how I would approach it: is get the practical bits first, and then cover the digital stuff later. So Ben, I'll turn it back to you, and then we can take questions.
Are you saying, David, that you're agreeing with me that we get the room to sound as good as it possibly can under the circumstances first, before and then maybe have less adjustments to do digitally, or to finalize the room in some way?
Yeah, no, it's otherwise it's just lipstick on a pig, is what we used to say in Alabama. And I think that's pretty apt. Or like, if you have a really terrible photograph and you try to Photoshop the heck out of it to make it into a good photograph, it doesn't work that way. You need a good image to start with.
Okay, so if we're going to approach, there are several things that we need to consider when setting up a room naturally, and that is the type of speaker drivers that the speakers that we're using, the position, the frequency response of those units, and also what I think is the dimension of the room should be more important than almost anything else. We're in a room right now that's roughly 20 feet by 15 feet